bills is in the correct order in which that will be heard. We're going to start with 2209, then 2208, and then 2159. So we'll open the hearing for House Bill 2209, and I will recognize David Fye, the Executive Director of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, which you hear is called the BSRB, because I probably should have called on Scott first. Let's do that. Scott, why don't you give us an explanation of the bill? Quit laughing at me. You've been laughing at me all morning. Please explain our bill, Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee. For purposes of this bill, I will try to be brief. There is a lot of technical kind of boilerplate language in the bill, as you would find in kind of any interstate compact or similar type of bill that creates an interstate or interjurisdictional agreement for a particular matter. House Bill 2209 would be the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, or PsyPact as it is called. This would provide for the interstate authorization to practice telepsychology or temporary authorization to practice in-person psychology between compact states, even where a psychologist is not licensed in the state where they are providing the services. So those two categories are what are described in the bill: the telepsychology, where a psychologist is licensed in their home state and can then practice telepsychology, provide services to a person in a distant state that is another compact state, or the temporary authorization for in-person practice. There are requirements for licensure for a psychologist to be able to practice in this manner, including that they hold an unrestricted license to practice psychology in their home state, meaning they can practice and are not subject to discipline or other limitation on their license or authority to practice by their home state regulatory authority, as well as some minimum education requirements to ensure that all licenses granted by compact states meet kind of a minimum set of standards to be shared among all of the compact states. The bill does authorize disciplinary action in distant states as it pertains to that state. So if a psychologist licensed in another compact state, for instance, were providing services in Kansas, the BSRB would be able to take action to limit that psychologist's practice in the state of Kansas. The home state would then be able to take action against the license of that psychologist based on the Kansas action or any other distant state, but does not require them to do so. And the opposite would also be true if Kansas became a member of this compact and a psychologist were limited in another state. The BSRB could consider that in taking action against a licensee as appropriate. The bill also includes a lot of, like I said, technical boilerplate language about the establishment of an interstate commission that would include one member from each of the compact states for the purpose. Yes.
I think we have to halt, because don't we have to be live on Harmony before we can proceed? That's my understanding, in order to not violate COMA.
That would be the best practice. Can I ask, does anybody know if we are live on YouTube?
Representative Parker's checking for us. I don't know where our IT person is.
We are live on YouTube.
Okay, great. Does that suffice, or do we need Harmony?
It's kind of a difficult question to answer. I think YouTube has become a common and normal enough use by the legislature and legislative committees that should suffice for public access.
Well, let me get hold of IT here.
Best practice would be if we were live to both.
Right.
Madam Chair, I just checked the feed on Harmony and I'm not having an issue with it.
Is it good now? All right, then I guess we are good. So thank you very much. Go ahead and proceed. I just want to make sure that we're being transparent and open. So I apologize for that, Scott. Proceed.
Sure, no worries. I was pretty much wrapping up at that point. The compact would become effective. And I'm sorry, I don't know the status of the compact in all of the other states that have either introduced or considered legislation on this topic, but it would become effective once enacted in the 7th compact states. The bill to make it effective in Kansas would take effect upon publication in the statute book, so July 1 of this year. And like I said, there's a lot of other kind of technical, mechanical things that I'm happy to explain if anybody has questions on them, but they are all pretty standard for this type of compact or agreement. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, are there questions of Revisor Abbott? All right, seeing none, we will proceed. And so now, for our first conferee, we'll have David Fye with the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, and many times you hear us call it the BSRB. So welcome to committee in your new capacity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to clarify, so we did provide testimony on this bill, but we did not request the bill. We did offer opponent testimony. I just wanted to see if you would like me to go ahead and go first.
That's fine.
Okay. Would you like me to keep my mask on for the testimony? Or?
It's a personal choice, whatever you desire.
Okay.
We like them off because we can hear you better, but we don't ask them to come off.
Okay, Madam Chair, and I have heard that some individuals prefer to read lips, so I'll just go ahead and take my mask off to allow for that too. As you mentioned, I am Dave Fye. I'm the new executive director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Our previous director, Max Foster, had served the agency for about 8 years and just recently retired on January 8th. And so I had an opportunity to work with Max for a little over a month, and I'm still getting up to speed on a lot of things with the agency, but I'm here to represent their position on House Bill 2209, which does involve SIPAC. You should have testimony from me. And in terms of the testimony, so the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board is charged to protect the consumers of services that receive services through their BSRB licenses. For the compact, that would affect the licensed psychologists that are covered in Kansas and also individuals who would be out of state under this if the bill is enacted. And in order to receive input from these types of measures, the board relies on advisory committees. And under the BSRB, there are 7 unique professions. For licensed psychologists, there is an advisory committee that did meet and spoke about SIPAC and made recommendations, had a lengthy discussion, made recommendations, and provided those to the board. And the board asked me to come to you all with some testimony concerning the bill. The board did have several concerns about SIPAC, and that is why they asked me to submit opponent testimony on the bill. The chief concerns that the board
You're an
raised...
opponent?
That is correct.
Well, okay, now we've got things out of order, David. I apologize. Let's have you wait, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right, because we always go with our proponents first, so. All right, thank you, David. That's on me. We just had this turned around backwards. My assistant and I are learning how to work things remote, and we've had a glitch here and there, but it's a lot smoother than what we've had in the past. Whitney Damron, I believe this was introduced by you, if I recall correctly, and I should have had you up first, so I apologize.
Quite all right, Madam Chair. Whitney Damron with the Kansas Psychological Association. We did request introduction of this bill and appreciate the opportunity to visit with you about it. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks and kind of set the stage, and then we have a couple of conferees that would be considered the resident experts on this kinds of legislation. Back in probably mid-2020, as the pandemic kind of gets underway and starts limiting everyone's ability to kind of see their clients, to engage in business activities and so forth, the Kansas Psychological Association started having an internal discussion about pursuing SIPAC, which kind of in its broad sense is like telemedicine for psychology. It also does permit some limited out-of-state, interstate service. If you have a client, for example, you're a Kansas doctoral level psychologist and you have a client that moves to Nebraska, you could perhaps go up there and meet with them on a limited number of days and so forth. So we opened the dialogue with the BSRB starting in July, followed up with the director again. My records indicate August 26th, provided them with the information on SIPAC, their website, the draft model legislation, which is what essentially every state that's gone down this path has adopted, something that looks very close to that with with slight modifications for statutory construct. Appreciate your revisor, Scott, who did that for us here in Kansas. Not an easy task on such a lengthy bill and a complicated issue. But we provided that to the BSRB. Really got no feedback from the director. Followed up again 1st of December. We're pursuing this bill. Here is the Model Act again. Again, here is SIPAC's informational website. It has a whole host of information on this subject. And about that time is when we're seeing the handoff from the former director to Mr. Fye. I had a conversation with Mr. Fye in December and kept him apprised of our progress leading up to today on this legislation. Before I pass things off to Janet Orwig, who's the executive director of SIPAC, she's going to speak to you virtually, and then Bud Dale, who is a Kansas psychologist and also an attorney, is here to speak. And I'd call your attention to Bruce Nystrom, PhD psychologist from Wichita, who is on the BSRB board. He's also on the psychology committee. He has written comments submitted for you. But these kind of compacts are not, this is not unique. Kansas has 3 in place already, one essentially for doctors, for medicine, for nursing, and for emergency management. And there's a 4th being considered in the Senate this year for audiology and speech pathology. So the states have gone down this path of trying to provide a regulatory framework for people to work multi-states to make sure everyone has the kinds of qualifications necessary, and also that the regulatory body has the ability to ensure the public safety of our citizens and conduct enforcement actions when necessary and appropriate. This legislation is passed in 15 states. So it is fairly robust in its implementation around the country. All 4 states surrounding Kansas have passed SIPAC: Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, Oklahoma. There are 14 other states plus the District of Columbia that have active bills this legislative session. So the profession is trending this way. Our opinion is that the regulatory bodies have been able to successfully manage the implementation of this. Throughout our conversations with BSRB, we did not hear of concerns with the bill. We heard that the BSRB may be neutral on the bill. It was a legislative policy issue. I heard secondhand yesterday that has changed, and so the BSRB has come out now against the bill. We think that is unfortunate. We think the BSRB has had significant amount of time to see this coming. Certainly, this legislature has spent quite a bit of time in the last 2 or 3 years on telehealth. We believe there are safeguards in place that we can manage this now. As the revisor indicated, this bill goes into effect July 1 of 2021. If this committee would like to provide a BSRB with more time, we would certainly not object to pushing this off to a January 1, 2022 timeframe to allow some time to take a look at that. We feel it would be unfortunate if we delayed consideration of legislation to next year, given the need for this kind of service to the public, certainly in these current times. So with that, Madam Chair, I know Janet Orwig is online, and she will talk about SIPAC and her role in kind of administering this program. Certainly a great resource to answer questions about the regulatory process, how the public is protected, what happens with complaints if someone is cited or brought up for an action in Kansas or even in another state, and essentially can get removed from SIPAC because of that, regardless of what maybe another state does. And with that, with the chairs, if you would allow, let her speak, and then Bud Dale and any of us would stand for questions. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I'll go through all the conferees, and then that way we'll have the questions all at once. What start date did you say you'd be willing to go out to?
The bill is July 1, 2021 statute book. We'd be willing to extend if there is need to extend further into 2022. We certainly would have a discussion about that if we needed to come back and tweak in the next legislative session. We just think we need to get this process started and get something going, and we'd hate to lose another year and push this down the road. But we certainly want to visit with BSRB. We know some of the challenges they have is their board only meets periodically, so trying to get them together to have further consideration of this maybe takes a little direction from the committee.
All right, thank you very much. Whitney.
Thank you.
All right, next I have Janet Orwig, Executive Director of PsychPact. Welcome to committee.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, hello. I am Janet Orwig. I'm the Executive Director of PsychPact, and I am here in support of House Bill 2209 that would open the door for the state of Kansas becoming part of PsychPact. My written testimony, I think, along with the two-page summary of the legislation and the PsychPact fact sheet was provided for your review previously. I would like to express my appreciation for your consideration of the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact legislation. PsychPact allows for the interstate practice of telehealth, as well as the ability to practice for a limited period of time while physically located in a PsychPact participating state. PsychPact is an interstate compact which provides a mechanism for the ethical and legal practice of telepsychology as it reduces regulatory barriers and provides for client-patient protection. As an interstate compact creates a contract among its members, and to join the compact, the state must adopt the same version of the compact language as other member states to preserve the contract that all states have agreed upon. The goal of PsychPact is to improve access to mental health services by facilitating the competent practice of telehealth by licensed psychologists across state lines, and represents a significant and crucial step in the profession of psychology. As people begin to understand more about mental health issues and the need to treat them, an increase of those seeking the services of psychologists may continue to grow. Unfortunately, like so many other health professions, psychologists are not always available in underserved areas. Increasingly, psychologists are using telehealth as a means to the demand for services. Psychology is uniquely suited to take advantage of telehealth services, as psychology intervention is talking and doesn't need additional equipment like many other medical specialties. When done via live video links, treatments are as effective as telehealth as when patients come to the psychologist's office. PsychPact would be particularly helpful when patients travel out of state, for patients such as family of military personnel who move frequently, and as has been seen during COVID. The American Psychological Association, or APA, surveyed the psychology workforce, and 96% of those surveyed said they were treating patients remotely. PsychPact provides protection to the public by certifying that psychologists have met acceptable standards of practice. It increases access to mental health care where care is not readily available, while at the same time providing for continuity of care for an increasingly mobile society. Importantly, it provides compact states with a mechanism to address disciplinary issues that occur across state lines. In my supplemental materials, a chart of how discipline is managed under PsychPact, as well as several rules of the PsychPact Commission that further define the roles of each state, were provided. PsychPact promotes public protection where none may currently exist for the interstate practice of telehealth. Several years of work preceded the final version of PsychPact, much of which was completed in collaboration with many other psychology professional organizations, such as the American Psychological Association and the American Insurance Trust. Through the collective process, PsychPact provides a means for providers to legitimately practice, as well as a mechanism for the oversight of such practice in such a manner as to benefit all parties. This is important for the profession as well as for the protection of the public. Thank you for your considering this very important mental health care issue.
Thank you very much, Janet. And then we'll have questions when we complete our other conferee. We have Milford Dale, PhD, and I believe you go by Bud, so welcome to committee.
I do. I go by Bud. I'm Bud Dale. I'm a PhD psychologist, and I'm also a family law attorney, and I do both. I'm here to tell you about my own experience using video conferencing technology in my work and how I got there. On March 7th of 2020, the Sunday morning, I woke up, was having a conversation with colleagues with the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts about our conference in New Orleans scheduled for late May, and we decided to cancel. On March 11 of 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 a pandemic. On March 12, I had the first person come in my office when I realized the seriousness of the pandemic, and they came in without a mask. They had called me earlier in the day and they needed a quick session. And I can tell you how scared I was with this person who'd come from work, wasn't clean, was dirty. I was scared. I couldn't talk the way I normally talk. I was afraid they had it. They could give it to me, that I could take it home and give it to my wife, because every time I've gotten sick, I've been very generous with my illness. My wife gets sick too. And I decided at that time that I would spend 30 minutes every morning learning about COVID. And from learning in those 30 minutes, I wrote a paper that has been published and literally been circulated around the world through the Journal of Psychology, Public Policy, and Law. And the title of that paper was Making the Case for Video Conferencing Technology in Child Custody Evaluations, which is my specialty. I work for the courts. I'm licensed in Kansas. I'm licensed in Missouri. I'm licensed in Texas. Right now I have a temporary license in Nebraska. When I do a home visit, I check to make sure that I can either do that without a license or whether I need permission or whether I need sponsored. I've had licenses in Alaska, in Tennessee, in Arizona, in Colorado, Virginia. My practice is local, it's regional, and it's national. And right now it's all by video conferencing. And I've presented all over the country from my office, New York, California, Colorado, Texas, where I'm talking about how to do this. What I found that I didn't know about, because I didn't need to know, or didn't think I needed to know, when I started looking at this was the telemedicine people built their platform, their approach on research. And they start with research with adults. And there is robust research about the equivalence between video conferencing and face-to-face contact across a number of services, across a number of mediums, to the point that there really isn't a debate right now about working with adults, so long as the medium is verbal in that kind of an exchange. The research of equivalence is there. Now, I'm board certified in clinical child psychology. And so I've also been talking with my colleagues, and in an international presentation in November, we surveyed the colleagues before we did the presentation. We did the presentation and then we surveyed them again. And what we found was, and what the other research that you would look at would find, is that the more people have training and experience with this, the more confident they feel about it and the better they get at it. One of the things I learned was that Kansas actually has some leaders in this with working with children. Dr. Evelyn Nelson at the KU Medical Center has been a leader of this for 20 years. It is different, and you have to learn, and I had to learn how to connect with people by this video medium. There are some things that you don't get. You don't get the smell, okay? If somebody was drunk, you wouldn't know. If somebody was unkept, you would only know the visual pieces, so there's different pieces of it. I want to tell you, and I'm going to stay short, I believe that we can do this, and I've staked my professional reputation on it. I moderate an international listserv with professionals on 4 different continents, and we debate this every single day. I want to tell you a story of one of the ways that video conferencing helped me. As I told you, my practice is local, it's regional, and it's national. And I was doing a child custody evaluation out of Manhattan, Kansas. And the father in that case was from a small town north of Manhattan. And the mother had moved to Council Bluff, Iowa. And I'm doing this interview with this mother. And there's 2 things I have to interview her about that are really hard. First, we found that she had been sexually abused by her grandfather, and that she had to testify 10 years after the abuse and got suicidal. That had actually contributed to her divorce. And I had to talk with her about that. And I did that by video conferencing. I also had to talk about the fact that her boyfriend had, her new boyfriend, had a brother who had gotten out of prison and spent 8 to 10 weeks in their home without telling dad. That was another conversation, was a little tough. At the end of every video conferencing session, I asked, how did this go? And what was it like to be doing this by video conferencing? And she didn't say much, it was fine. When I got to her the next time, I said, well, do you have any comments about last time? And she said, yes, I do. And my first comment is, you know, that stuff about my grandpa, that was hard. And I knew it was hard. She had cried. And she said, but you know what? I knew I was safe. I knew I wasn't in somebody else's office. I knew who was in my house, and I knew I was safe. Now, that part that you had to ask me about my boyfriend's brother, that wasn't very easy either. But you know what? At the end of that interview, I didn't have to go get in my car and drive from Topeka 3.5 hours to Council Bluff. I walked out from that session into my support environment, and there were my people. And we got ready for dinner instead of getting into a car and driving. There are a number of advantages to this approach. Getting to underserved people, getting quality people to people who would never otherwise get contact with them.
Bud, and I hate
It
to
is
cut you
effective.
short, but I've got
So I'm going to stop.
one more conferee and questions, and I've got 2 more bills to hear this afternoon. So,
I could talk forever, but thank you for this opportunity.
well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Okay, is there anyone that I did not call as a proponent on House Bill 2209? All right, seeing none. Committee, you have written only testimony from Bruce Nystrom, past president of Kansas Psychology Association. And now we'll look at opponents. So David Fye, let's bring you right back. Oh, wait. Yeah, we'll bring you right back up, and then we're going to ask questions of everyone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I am Dave Fye, Executive Director for the BSRB. And when I had spoken earlier in the meeting today, one thing I wanted to stress is that these are the positions of the board as were recommended. And what I said earlier too, you know, the BSRB, the primary mission of the agency is to protect the consumers of services offered by the BSRB licenses. And so in my testimony, you know, I did mention the board appreciates the need for increased availability of services, and particularly in rural areas. But the board does oppose the bill at this time for 3 main reasons. And the first is a lack of clarity involved in how consumers would submit complaints against out-of-state psychologists who are providing services to Kansans. The second item is a lack of specificity in terms of how the BSRB would need to alter its investigative procedures with that many additional out-of-state practitioners that were not officially underneath the BSRB in terms of their licensure. And the third was a concern in regards to the operating of the agency. Currently, we do have out-of-state licensed psychologists providing services in Kansas, but they do so either under a license through the BSRB, where the BSRB has an opportunity to review the qualifications to see if they meet the standards that Kansas has for those professions, or to do an out-of-state temporary permit, which provides up to 15 days of in-state practice. But in either case, the individual would be underneath the BSRB, and there would be ways to track back in case there are complaints. But with that additional funding that would be removed from the revenue for the agency, and the expected additional number of complaints that would be filed, it could cause some difficulty in terms of our investigative procedures for the agency to follow up on those complaints from additional practitioners in Kansas. And so the board did recommend that I submit testimony in opposition to this bill. And they wanted me to express that the board does not feel this has adequate protections for the citizens of Kansas at this time, but it would recommend tabling the bill to allow the advocates for this bill to work more with the advisory committee and the board in terms of fleshing out the Kansas-specific components so that we can ensure that the citizens of Kansas are adequately protected if Kansas does decide to join SIPACT at a certain time. And Madam Chair, I could stand for any questions.
All right, thank you very much. Is there anyone else that wished to be an opponent that I did not call upon? All right, seeing none, committee, we're now open for questions. Do we have questions for any of our conferees? Representative Barker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mine is to the Executive Director of SIPAC. Looking at the bill, and I'm
Need to
on
be a little closer to the mic, Representative. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Could you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. There's two questions I have. One is, I sit on an interstate compact for adult offenders, and the rulemaking process you have here, one, I would need to know how many states and where those states are located. And if you could just supply that to the committee so we would all have that. I didn't see anything in the bill that listed all the 5. And under the rulemaking, of course, the majority would rule, and then we would adopt a rule that maybe it would not be good for Kansas. And that's one of my concerns. And do you have any information where that has happened, where a state, where you actually adopted a rule that would cause a state some concern, where they would either come back and leave the compact? We've had that in my compact that I work on, where a state said, we just physically cannot do this rule because of our statutes. So they had to withdraw from the compact. That's my first question. Has that ever happened?
Madam Chair, committee members, no, it has not at this time. Our commission actually, as was mentioned very nicely about Mr. Abbott, we did have to have 7 states to enact the legislation to get up and going. We had that happen in April of 2019. The commission was set in July of 2019. So we have not had that happen with that since then. We currently have 15 states that are members, and none of them have had any issues with the rules that the commission has drafted.
Thank you. And my second question, Madam Chair, if you'll give me leave, do you have any data where complaints have been made by a licensed psychologist who was not in that state, and how that state handled it, and how many of those complaints have resulted in the state who filed the action actually had either a disciplinary hearing or a judicial hearing or an administrative hearing on that individual?
I do not have any data at this time, and I'm kind of, it's one of those things you're not sure you want to put out into the atmosphere. We have not had that occur yet. So we have not had any complaints filed in any of the compact states against a practicing psychologist. I do think it's important to note that psychology as a profession is very small in numbers and does not necessarily have the number of disciplinary complaints across the country that other professions have. I did a little bit of research for Kansas, and it looks like for the last 5 years, Kansas has only reported 7 disciplinary actions to the National Practitioner Data Bank. And the entire profession of psychology across the U.S. has only reported a little over 1,900 to the National Practitioner Data Bank.
Madam Chair, just one last question. You mentioned that because of the underserved areas, that this would be important. Do you have any data where the underserved areas who may have a few psychologists, those psychologists would then leave and go to a more or a larger metropolitan area because they could now handle it by video conference? And so that would affect the local economy or the local underserved areas.
Have not seen that happen. As I cited earlier with the American Psychological Association's data of the psychology workforce during this time, they are seeing actually an increase in referrals across the board by 39%. So trying to find, just to meet the needs of what the psychologist is receiving, I don't think they've been soliciting outside of just trying to manage the needs that people are seeing during this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any further questions, committee? Representative Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This may be for any of the proponents, but Mr. Fye laid out basically, I think, 3 main objections with the bill as we go through committee process, whether in this committee or any others. Sometimes there are issues that cannot be sorted out by compromise, and at the end of the day, you know, one side or the other is going to get aligned in a bill that works out their way. But other times, there are times when we can accommodate the needs of multiple parties and come to an agreement. I know I'm putting you all on the spot, but as Mr. Fye laid out those particular objections, does there seem to be anything within that that fundamentally we wouldn't be able to find an agreement and be able to bring an amendment to this bill that could work for all?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, unfortunately, we have not seen that, have not seen the testimony. I will get with Director Fye. I'm sure we can at least respond to that. In visiting with the director prior to the meeting, said we look forward to sitting down afterwards and taking a look at what concerns might be and see how we can address them. Perhaps calling upon Janet and taking a look at what's happened in other states and putting together some documents. It does certainly sound like, at least from her comments, that there would not be a significant amount of additional workload in regard to ethics or complaints, but obviously the committee wants to know how those would be addressed regardless if there's 1 or 100. So we will do that.
I appreciate that. I know I was putting you on the spot, so any follow-up on that would be great. Madam Chair, I think maybe the opponent has a comment on that.
Proponent or?
Well, looks like both, so.
Bud first and then David Fye.
Wish I remembered all 3 of them, but I felt like the first 2 were simply about being educated about what PsychPAC really already called for. The procedures about where the complaint would be filed. I think PsychPAC addresses that. I think a number of professionals don't know that when you talk with somebody across a state line, you have to have a license in both places. The second one was, again, I think it was about some specificity about procedures. And again, I think that was just about education in the bill. I don't recall the third one, and if I did, I didn't think it was a big major objection that couldn't be figured out with more education and dialogue.
David?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just for the sake of transparency, I did receive a call yesterday from Whitney Dameron, who asked what the objections from the board were towards this bill. And I was happy to lay out exactly what I have here in the testimony for you, just to let any interested party know exactly what the board's position on the bill was. But the 3 items in your testimony is the lack of clarity concerning how the consumers would report complaints. And that does tie into, right now, if someone submits a complaint to the agency, we have a system that keeps track of all the licensed psychologists, whether they have in-state license, if they're an out-of-state practitioner. But you add a new element of PsychPAC, there's going to be some confusions from individuals receiving services from individuals who didn't go through the normal process. Also, there's a lack of specificity concerning how our investigative process would work, negotiating with all these different states when you have a number of in-state practitioners who could be either through telepsychology or in person coming across state lines for the 30 days that are allowed in PsychPAC. So there's a lot of these details still to be fleshed out. The third has to do with the effect on operations from the BSRB, and I believe this is something the board did stress at their meeting that was a big concern. When you have this revenue going to an independent party rather than the state of Kansas, but you have additional complaints that need to be investigated, that's going to call for more hours by the investigative team. It's also going to call for decreased revenue because that's no longer going to Kansas. So you have increased costs, decreased revenue, and having to put this all together with the implementation date of July 1st, fleshing out all the details to make sure that we can adequately protect the citizens of Kansas. There's still a whole lot of details, and that's why the board took the position that they wanted to sit down and really flesh through these details, and that's why they recommended to table it for this session, because they didn't want to rush this in the interest of just providing more services. The number one priority was if someone's providing services to Kansans, we need to make sure they're doing it in a safe and secure way.
All right, thank you, David. Are there further questions? Representative Bergquist, I think that will be our last question. If you have further, you can email the conferees. The information should be on there because we do have 2 more bills, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick 2 questions for anyone who wants to answer them or can. How long has PsychPAC been an organization in these, I think, 15 member states? Is that correct? How many years has PsychPAC been in existence?
May Madam Chair?
Yes.
SIPAC actually got the language approved in February of 2015, and our first state, Arizona, enacted in 16 because we were a little late for the legislative session at that time. So we have 15 states currently that have been working with us.
Thank
And
you,
I
Madam
could
Chair.
address some of those other concerns, but I'm not sure you have time. So
Mostly my question is, as a follow-up is, how many years have you been seeking to gain favor in the state of Kansas?
this is the first time we've had a bill introduced in Kansas.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Committee, we're going to go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2209. And I would suggest that the conferees and the opponents perhaps have a visit between now and whenever is. So thank you very much. Now we'll open up the hearing for House Bill 2208. And I'll have Scott Abbott go over the bill.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. House Bill 2208 is a bill that amends a number of provisions relating to Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board licensure of the numerous professions under its jurisdiction. It does a few things kind of globally for all of the major professions that the board regulates, as well as some profession-specific provisions. So a couple of the kind of global provisions that are in the bill. The first is relating to disciplinary action by the board. Statute lays out the grounds that the board has for enforcement or disciplinary action against a licensee or a person. It would add to that list of grounds that the person has violated any lawful order or directive previously entered by the board. It would also expand the current ground for discipline or enforcement action based on the revocation, suspension, or limitation of a person's license in another state. Currently, that's limited to the license that they hold in the state of Kansas. So for a professional counselor, they've had a professional counseling license in another state, limited or restricted or revoked. It would broaden those grounds to include any professional registration that the board considered. Would also grant the board the authority to waive the face-to-face requirement for clinical supervision hours under a finding of extenuating circumstances. That's a pretty recurring amendment throughout the bill for the numerous professions under the board's jurisdiction. The bill would also enact a new section of law effective January 1 of 2022 that would require any licensee that provides postgraduate clinical supervision for an individual working towards licensure as a clinical social worker. It would require those supervisors to be board approved and kind of have a separate approval process and fee with some requirements attached to that. Would require such a supervisor to have been licensed as a specialist clinical social worker for at least 2 years, to not be subject to any disciplinary action, and to have completed some supervision-specific continuing education hours. The bill would make a few changes for the licensure of clinical professional counselors. The practicum requirement currently has a minimum hours requirement of 350 hours. The bill would reduce that to 280. It would also reduce the number of postgraduate supervised professional experience hours from 4,000 to 3,000. This may look familiar as this was just done for social workers, maybe another profession, I forget, but at least social workers just in the past couple of years. It would also change the individual hours requirement from 150 hours of individual supervision experience or supervised experience to 100 hours of face-to-face experience, including 50 hours of individual supervision. The board can already waive 1/2 of those hours for a person with a doctoral degree. It would specify that those hours must be completed in not less than 1 year. The bill would also make some similar amendments for licensure of specialist clinical social workers for the practicum requirements, similarly reducing the number of hours from 350 to 200, and the required hours of individual supervision from 75 hours to 50 hours. For clinical marriage and family therapists, it makes some similar changes. The postgraduate supervised professional experience would be reduced from 4,000 to 3,000 hours. Would also grant them the authority to waive the face-to-face requirement in extenuating circumstances. And the similar change for the waiving of 1/2 of the hours for a person with a doctoral degree imposes the same 1 hour or 1 year minimum of completing those hours. The last profession that's addressed by the bill specifically is clinical addiction counselors. Again, many of the same changes. The 4,000 hour requirement to post-grad supervised professional experience will be reduced to 3,000. The individual hours requirement would go from 150 to 100 of face-to-face hours, including 50 hours of individual, and the similar provision for waiving 1/2 of those hours for a person with a doctoral degree. The final change that it makes is related to temporary permits for out-of-state practitioners for all 6 of the main professions that are regulated by the BSRB. It adds the requirement that a person seeking a temporary permit have engaged in the clinical practice in the other jurisdiction for at least 2 years immediately preceding their application. It adds a quarterly reporting requirement on the number of days that the person has practiced in the state of Kansas under that permit. It increases the maximum number of days of practice in that year from 15 days in current law to 30 days, changes the expiration of that temporary permit from December 31 of the year when the permit is granted to 1 year after granted. And it also allows for extension of the temporary permit for an additional 1 year with an additional 30 days of practice within that year. Other than the new section for boards approved clinical supervisors for social work, which takes effect January 1 of 2022, the balance of the bill would take effect upon publication in the statute book on July 1 of this year. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. Our first proponent for House Bill 2208 is David Fye with the BSRB. And I believe that you introduced this bill, David.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am Dave Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, and we did provide some testimony, 2 pages. This was a bill that was requested on behalf of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. This bill was the product of a number of different discussions between the different advisory committees and the board, these are the official recommendations for statutory changes by the board. The board really wanted to stress that its primary objective is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare from unlawful unprofessional practitioners, but also make sure that the qualifications for licensure and different items within the professions are not in the way of allowing additional individuals to provide services to Kansans. So that is the product of this bill before you. We do have about 13,100 individuals who are licensed under the BSRB in 7 unique professions, and I've included a little bit of language there. Scott did a great job explaining the different items in the bill. I just wanted to touch on a few of those for the committee. One of the items that is the biggest change would be an item that would adjust the number of postgraduate supervised work experience towards a clinical degree for 4 different professions. And that has to do with a bill that passed in 2019, lowered these number of hours as well as the direct supervision hours for clinical social work license from 150 to 100, and as I mentioned, it lowered the number of supervised hours of experience from 4,000 to 3,000. Additionally, there was a legislative committee that met over the interim on mental health modernization and reform, and one of the recommendations from the workforce categorization for that committee was to take immediate action to lower the number of professional hours under these professions, and that is what the board recommended including in the bill. So this would lower those hours for marriage and family therapists, professional counselors, master's degree psychologists, professional counselors, and addiction counselors. Next, the board recognizes that there's a need for more services under the pandemic, and it included language that would allow all clinical supervision to be done over televideo rather than in person. And additionally, if there are extenuating circumstances, they would be allowed to do telephonic supervision as well, but that would be a determination made by the board for the extenuating circumstances. And that is for master's level psychology, social work, professional counseling, marriage and family therapists, and addiction counseling. As I mentioned earlier, the board does allow for an out-of-state temporary permit Prior to the pandemic, the agency had a handful of these each year, but due to the pandemic, we saw a number of these increase. So the board wanted to make additional protections for individuals pursuing this type of license, but also wanted to allow individuals in Kansas to receive more services from people providing these services. So the board recommended 5 changes. One, currently in statutes, these out-of-state temporary permits can provide 15 days of in-state service. The board wanted to increase that to 30 days. The expiration date in statute would expire on December 31st, but the board wanted to allow a year-long window, so the change in the bill would be to extend that for 1 year after it's approved. Second, the board wanted to add a protection that these individuals practicing in Kansas would have similar experience to those who are licensed in Kansas, so it would add a requirement that individuals with this temporary permit would practice 2 years prior to in their jurisdiction prior to obtaining these temporary permits. And then the board added a requirement for quarterly reports as an accountability measure to know when people are practicing in-state. And then added some language to clarify that you could have 1 additional year if you wanted an extension, and you would get 30 additional days of in-state practice if you wanted to do that, and that would be under emergency circumstances. The bill also includes a provision to have board-approved clinical supervisors for social workers, and a one-time fee cap would be set in the bill of $50. The board recommended pursuing regulations to set that at $25, but that would be a one-time fee. Additionally, in reviewing the statutes, the board already has a board-approved supervisor for professional counseling, and additionally for marriage and family therapist, but that amount for the cap was never set in statute. So you'll see some similar language to establish it uniformly across those 3 professions. And just a few more items that are included in the bill. Professional counselor practicum direct client hours are lowered from 350 hours to 280 hours, and the social work practicum direct client contact hours are lowered from 350 hours to 200 hours. There's also some statutory language that was added to consider disciplinary action against any type of professional license in another state when the board is making a determination of eligibility to practice in Kansas. And there was also language added to allow the board to take disciplinary action for anyone who's violated a lawful order or directive of the board, when that language does not currently appear in the statutes. And the last item is that there's a professional counselor temporary license that is currently in the statute of 6 months, but the other professions have a temporary license of 12 months. So this would be changing it from 6 months to 12 months to have that be uniform across the professions. And Madam Chair, I realize I covered a lot of ground, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any questions about what is included in the bill or what the board recommended.
All right, thank you. We'll go through the list of conferees, and we'll do questions at the end, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, I have Kyle Kessler, Executive Director with the Community Mental Health Centers of Kansas. Welcome to committee, Kyle.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am Kyle Kessler, Executive Director at the Association of Community Mental Health Centers. We appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony in support of House Bill 2208 this afternoon. And really, just to be brief and summarize our testimony, this is one of the recommendations from the Mental Health Modernization and Reform Committee. A couple pieces of this directly are related to workforce enhancement initiatives. So the reduction in the number of hours to become licensed, as well as the value and importance and allowability of supervision by televideo. Those are both pieces we strongly support, and we would stand for questions at the appropriate time, but that pretty much concludes our testimony.
All right, thank you very much, Kyle. Next, I have Becky Fass, the Executive Director of the National Association of Social Workers. Welcome to committee, Becky.
Hello, Madam Chair and committee. Thank you.
Is that mic on?
Oh, hello? Hi.
You gotta hit a button.
Oh, yeah, they hit it. Sorry, there.
There we are.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Becky Fast. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Chapter of Social Workers. The Mental Health Modernization Committee heard many testimonies last year about how we need more social workers from Larned State hospitals to our prisons to our mental health centers. This bill reduces one barrier by allowing telehealth, which we very much support, but it also has two barriers that we are concerned about to grow our profession and to grow the mental health workforce in Kansas. The first barrier is that Kansas requires an additional 350 hours above the national standard of 900 hours to become a clinical social worker. No other state has this requirement, and so often our bachelor's level students, they go out of state because of this additional 350 hours. It's made it hard for us to grow our own. So we ask that you strike this 350 hours. BSRB, we've been working with BSRB. They said, well, middle ground would be 200. Well, no other state has this, so we ask that you remove it completely. The second barrier that we're really concerned about during the pandemic, during a crisis workforce shortage, is that they're adding another mandate and requirements. It's on the first page of the bill, that if a licensed master social worker wants to become a clinical social worker, they're going to have to go through all these steps and become a board-approved social worker. So for instance, if there's a social worker in Larned and there's no board-approved clinical supervisor there, they might have to contract with someone in Kansas City or convince their supervisor to go to all these steps. So we feel like that will make it more longer, more expensive, and harder to become a clinical trained social worker. In fact, in 2016, the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, they amended this first page out because they heard so much about the workforce shortage. Only 17 states have this requirement, and so given our critical workforce issues, we ask that we not adopt that additional mandate right now. If you look at my testimony, we only have 100 clinical social workers in Western Kansas. Kansas, unlike our neighboring states, only 30% of our clinical workforce is clinical level. So we're in a dire situation, and we feel like this additional mandate will make it harder, take it longer, and make it more expensive for someone to become a clinical social worker. I just wanted to thank the Chair Landwehr and all of you 2 years ago for passing social work reciprocity. Our social workers on the state line now can practice across state line, and you led the way, and now the other professions are doing what we did 2 years ago. And so BSRB has 5 professions that don't have this mandated supervisor requirement. They have 2 that do, but for social work, only 17 states have all the requirements in here. And as I said, in 2016, they amended that out. Last week, you heard from the Ford County Mental Health Director. He said lack of workforce is the #1 barrier to a healthy Kansas. And we ask that you consider removing these 2 barriers, and we fully support the rest of the bill to allow mental health definitions.
All right. Thank you, Becky, but I also want to give credit out to the BSRB board because they were very willing and able to help us move that reciprocity along. Next, I have Tanya Rickless. Did I pronounce that right with Washburn?
Yes, Rickless is right. Yep.
Okay. There you are. I'm sorry. I don't know who's on WebEx and who's in the room, so welcome to committee.
Thank you. As we've been teaching on Zoom at Washburn University, welcome to our world. That's what we've been handling.
And you're with the social work department. You
Yes.
are the social work department chair at
I
Washburn.
am the social
Welcome
work
to
department
committee.
chair. Thank you. And thank you very much, Madam Chairman and members of the committee for letting me speak today. I want to share with you, the positive impact that the passage of House Bill 2208 will have on our social work students. And these social work students are the future of the social work profession in the state of Kansas. Updating face-to-face requirements for direct service hours to include telehealth services and dropping the Kansas requirement from 350 to 200 direct client contact hours will remove an unnecessary burden that has been placed on our students. These additional requirements, as Becky just talked about, are above and beyond the national accreditation standards that most people in other states have to pass. So we are asking our students to do additional hours that really don't necessarily have a connection to showing that we're putting out other quality social work students with these additional hours. There we go. Delivering services via telehealth is a service delivery model that will not be disappearing at the end of the COVID pandemic. And can you guys hear me? Because it keeps going. Good. It's an effective way to deliver services in rural areas of Kansas, as well as to clients in urban areas struggling to access services. Because of Kansas's requirement that direct service be defined as face-to-face, master level students' requirement to achieve 350 direct client contact hours, students, when asked to provide telehealth services that are critical skills for them to learn, are often hesitant to do this telehealth services because they're concerned about it not counting towards their clinical hours and direct hours. These students are currently just focused on trying to get to the end goal of graduation, of course. And so putting this unnecessary burden on them, asking to do this additional work that they're confused about when they're seeing professions across the state and across the nation delivering telehealth services, as you heard in the last bill, which is becoming very common. I fully support high educational and ethical standards for students and practicing social workers, but those standards need to have a rationale that supports why they exist. No other state expects 350 direct client hours, and other states have already defined telehealth as direct service. Also, with the growth of online social work programs, our Kansas universities are facing growing competition for students in an already shrinking possible student pool. Adding additional standards that our students in Kansas must meet creates problems for future recruitment for Kansas universities. In summary, dropping the direct client face-to-face expectations for social work students will greatly support our Kansas students in achieving their educational goals. Again, I don't want to underplay the competition that we are starting to have from outside universities that are online. Students do look at the amount of practicum hours that we have to do that are in addition, and that is part of their decisions in deciding schools. And these students that will be graduating from our local programs stay local. They stay and they practice in Kansas. Dropping the direct client face-to-face expectations will support our Kansas students in achieving their educational goals. Many of our students and faculty would like to thank you for your consideration of this support for our students in their journey to serve the citizens of Kansas as practicing social workers. And I'd be happy to take questions now or at the end.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Next, I have Rachel Marsh, and I do know how to pronounce your name, Rachel, with the Children's Alliance of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. My name is Rachel Marsh, and I am with the Children's Alliance of Kansas. And it's easy for me to present after hearing the previous three speakers. I think Kyle Kessler helped explain that this is we support this bill as a support for addressing the workforce shortage in behavioral health. And I think that I wanted to just share why this bill is uniquely impactful for foster children and foster care providers. We, as child welfare providers of the Children's Alliance, see firsthand the shortage of mental health and how it impacts not only our ability to attract and retain licensed masters in clinical social workers, but how other agencies and our community partners also face barriers in their workforce. And when we have workforce shortages, it contributes to high caseloads for therapists, reduced client treatment contact for children who need regular therapy, and the burnout that happens when you have high caseloads and feel less effective, and that causes high turnover. So we just want to point out that this bill has a unique impact on children in the foster care system, and thank you for your consideration of it. I also wanted to point out something that I personally have seen in working in child welfare over the years, and that is the importance of the ability to get a clinical license to supporting a trained and retained workforce. I tried to think back as I was getting ready to testify today at how many conversations I've had over the years with master's level social workers who were working at providers who were seeking their clinical license, and when they were getting their clinical license support, they were thrilled and happy to stay. And when they had barriers in getting their clinical license support, they were threatening to leave or leaving, because it's that important. If you're a professional who wants to obtain your professional license, you want to advance quickly. That brings me to my concern for the board approved requirement for supervision of social workers seeking clinical because I have seen firsthand, and our member agencies have experienced firsthand, when people can't access their clinical supervision, they will go elsewhere where they can, which has a detrimental effect to our foster care providers. We're concerned mostly about the timing of this requirement during the pandemic. I can't express enough how hard child welfare providers and mental health professionals have been working throughout this last year. We've seen the mental health needs of children, as you know, as you've been hearing, parents, everyone is so high. And so to ask a clinical supervisor who's been doing this for a long time to take another course or another 3 different requirements as laid out in the bill might be enough for them to say, it's just not worth it to me. And even one person not doing that is going to have an impact on clinical supervision for social workers. So we are asking for you to either strike that new board approved requirement or looking at making that line, that on-ramp, something that is grandfathered in for current supervisors, or really reducing and making very clear that that barrier that's going to be implemented this year to becoming a board approved supervisor would be very limited. I'm concerned about the academic supervision requirement. What does that mean? I'm concerned about the initial amount of continuing education hours that's unlimited in the bill right now, and then the ongoing CEU hours. All 3 of these things together, I think, could make it enough of a barrier that a clinical supervisor would choose not to, and we will see that impact in our quality of services. So I appreciate the opportunity to bring that perspective to your committee, and happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Written testimony only committee, we have Linda Bass, Andrew Seckler, Carrie Josie, Stuart Little, Cynthia Schendel, and Tim DeWeese. I have neutral testimony from Kelly Jones, Associate Professor of Practice of Director of Field Education at KU School of Social Welfare. Are you with us, Kelly? Oh, there you are. You're in the room. We kind of get pleasantly surprised when people are in the room.
I'm social
so
worker enough to know that it's good to be in person. And caught here on my mask, I'll leave it. So my name is Kelly Jones. I am the Director of Field Education at the KU School of Social Welfare, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. I have a neutral position, as you mentioned, on House Bill 2208, and I wanted to provide some education on specifically on the issue around 200 hours of direct client contact time. So I'm affirming what my colleagues have said before me. This is a non-standard requirement that doesn't exist in any other state, nor does it exist in any field education social work literature, nor do we see it in our requirements for accreditation. I want to tell you a story from my morning. This is just a coincidence, but I was working with a young social worker in Southeast Kansas this morning who told me that she was not sure whether she could meet the 200 hours of direct client contact requirement or the current 350. She has taken up a application for a job in Oklahoma and asked me to serve as her reference, which I will do. And I want to be neighborly, but I very much prefer that she stay in Southeast Kansas, where I know she is needed and is a phenomenal student. So for me, in terms of looking at this workforce enhancement, I would challenge that this might have a consequence on our ability to continue to retain social work students. I routinely see them leave for Colorado and Missouri, and it's becoming frustrating to me. Additionally, I would add to my written testimony that I submitted that this particular requirement has had an impact on the type of innovation that we can do in our curriculum. I am restricted in some of the innovation that our peers are doing in other social work field education departments in order to prepare my students for their ability to practice. I am so guided by this 350 direct client contact hours that I'm not always able to do the things that I would like to do that my peers are doing in places like Missouri. So I would request that you consider amending the bill to strike the 200-hour requirement and help me keep social workers in Kansas better serving our people who have very high needs, and we have a responsibility to serve them. Thank you. I'll add this one thing that just my thought. The social workers do not do practice that is talk therapy. We're not necessarily sitting down and having always a consultation where it's one-on-one, you and I having this conversation. My students are in the VA right now helping veterans that are in transition. They're in hospitals spending 5 or 10 minutes with a family that's trying to make it a determination about where their loved one is going to live that has dementia. They're not necessarily doing talk therapy. We do not count hours in the same way that our other professions do. So I appreciate the BSRBs want to have uniformity across professions, but we're not the same profession. So I appreciate your consideration, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The question was actually asked of me is, are you neutral or are you a proponent? I think you're actually in between there.
I can tell you I am neutral. I'm very excited about this opportunity to pass this bill. I'm also very excited about the opportunity to amend the 200 hours.
All right, thank you very much. All right, committee, I don't show any further proponents, opponents, which we had none of, or neutral. So I'm open to questions at this time. Representative Epley.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And this question's for David. If you could come back, please, real quick. And it's pretty simple. As you're coming up, I just want to comment and to the committee and say I appreciate the good work that's gone into this bill. This is quite comprehensive, and I just want to hear it from you one more time. This makes us pretty much on par with many other states, and puts us on equal footing now as far as requirements and hours and practicums and so forth. In your opinion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my opinion, it does in a number of different categories. I mean, there are different professions under the board, but the biggest component in this bill that was also a recommendation by the Mental Health Modernization and Reform Committee to lower those number of hours from the 4,000 to the 3,000 and the 150 to the 100. Back in 2019, there was some information that we were on the higher end of that for the social workers, and I believe that by adjusting those hours to the 3,000 and 100, that would make us more in line with sort of the national standard.
More question. And just the second question to follow up, and I've read this carefully, and yet it's kind of doublespeak when you talk about face-to-face versus other methods of getting your hours met, and I want to make sure I've got this, that for the practicums and for the licensure that we can, that they will be able to get that virtually as opposed to being face-to-face?
So for the majority of the professions, licensed psychology is one that is a little bit different in their requirements. But for the majority of the professions, the previous language in the statutes said in person, and this would change to face-to-face, which would allow the televideo. The definition of direct client contact is being changed in the regulations to allow for some telephonic. So it kind of depends on the type of hours, but in terms of this person-to-person, it would be changed to face-to-face to allow for the televideo, and then on some of that, if there was an emergency or extenuating circumstances, then you could allow for some telephonic.
So in today's world, much of it could be obtained, or most of it could be obtained virtually then?
Correct, and that was in part because of the pandemic, in part because of a lack of providers in certain areas, and then also due to some concerns about technology and signal strength and different things like that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is Kyle Kessler still with us?
Kyle, are you still on?
Yes, Madam Chair.
All right, go ahead, Representative Parker.
Kyle, we heard, sounds like pretty broad agreement from the academic side of this and our conferees with the universities about potentially eliminating all the extra hours beyond what the national standard is, or possibly even eliminating the supervision mandate. Could you comment on, do you think that would help grow our mental health workforce? And if you want to answer just yes or no, that's fine. But if you want to elaborate, that's great too.
Yes is the fast answer. I think that if we look at our association, and it's in line very much with what Director Fast mentioned as well, I think that we oppose any additional supervisory requirements or anything beyond what's necessary to provide the most skilled workforce, as well as trying to expedite their process into the workforce. So I think that you're asking the right question for sure, Representative, but I think that by looking at the amendment that's proposed by the Kansas chapter, the National Association of Social Workers, and the bill itself, I think it gets us really close to this being just a rock solid bill.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Reese.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for David Fry. Hi, David. I have two questions regarding supervision. Do you know how many social workers are currently under a clinical supervision plan? In other words, they are working towards their independent clinical licensure.
Madam Chair, I don't have that information. I can tell you currently, if individuals are pursuing the clinical level licensure, they are required to submit a plan for approval by the board. But the supervisor is not currently required to be a board-approved clinical supervisor.
But we don't know the numbers of how many social workers are under a plan right now?
You know, I'll have to go back and pull that number, and I'll provide it to the committee.
Okay. And then the second one is, and I think you've already answered it too, is how many supervisors are also providing the clinical supervision for those social workers under the plan? I know it's been my experience that clinical social workers are in short commodity in the state, and we're the ones that can provide the supervision for social workers wanting to get that higher level of licensure. There's so few of us that it, I would think that being able to, amend this House Bill 2208 and take that 350 hours out might help us be able to grow our clinical social workers in the state so that they can then provide that supervision to the other social workers that are looking for that.
And Madam Chair, would you like me to respond to that? So in terms of the dropping the number down from 350 to 200 hours, it's my understanding that these direct client contact hours that are part of the practicum, in other states, they might have some language that would talk about different things that would be required, but we are the state that has the number of hours identified. But in other states, there is something in terms of the practicum, it's just not identified by a certain hour total. So we are unique in that way. In terms of the supervision, the board did have a discussion about that topic, and like people have talked about, that has come up in the past concerning supervisors for clinical board-approved supervisors for social workers. And it's my understanding that part of the reason that this was encouraged and recommended by the board had to do with there have been issues in the past in terms of disciplinary actions and some confusion concerning the role of the supervisor for these social workers. And this would allow the board to ensure that the clinical supervisors have updated information and are continuing to get information about the best practices to supervise. The agency would not want it to be a barrier to prohibit people from becoming licensed in social work, but it falls under the category of protecting the public to make sure that everyone is on the same page about what is expected and in the role of the supervisor.
Thank you.
Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I think your mic is probably still dead from yesterday or the day before.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. Oh.
Okay, so maybe it is working finally. I need some technical luck. I also have a question about the number of current supervisors, and is it the intention of the BSRB that we're starting tabula rasa and there are no board approved clinical supervisors, and we're starting all over and everybody has to jump through the hoops, or is there the possibility of grandfathering in?
So, Madam Chair, in terms to that point, this would be starting January 1st of 2022. So anyone who's providing clinical supervision at that point, would need to be approved by the board as a board-approved supervisor. And so that's kind of how that would fall. But it would allow some time for individuals to go ahead and follow up on those requirements to be a board-approved supervisor. And just to clear up a little bit of some of the topics that were brought up earlier, in terms of the number of hours in the bill that is called for, those would not be in addition to the normal hours that a social worker would be obtaining over the course of their licensure period. Every 2 years, a social worker needs 40 hours of continuing education. So these would just be part of that required number of hours. So I just wanted to clarify that point too.
Madam Chairman, if I might again, I find it difficult to understand if we don't know how many supervisors there are at the moment, how we would be now saying they've got to meet this certain standard by a certain date. I mean, are there a dozen, 100, 200?
And Madam Chair, I'm happy to get that information. Okay. And it was also mentioned too, in terms of the availability of individuals obtaining those classes to obtain this board-approved distinction. Some of those classes I have heard are offered by the National Association, and individuals can do those online. So there is some availability on that where you would you hear the information and you would submit a test from what I have learned in this area. So I just wanted to clarify a point on that too. But I can go ahead and do some additional research and find out the number of people that are currently under the supervision and the number of the supervisors in Kansas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fye. We appreciate your providing us with information on that. I think that what we've got to do as a state is look at providing more incentives for more professionals in the field, especially in the mental health field where we know there's a drastic shortage, and look for ways that we could incentivize folks to want to go into the supervision end of things so that we have more clinical social workers in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second time here. I have a question for Director Fast. We'll let you sit back down, David. I can ask while you're walking up. Just following up on my previous question and some that have been asked before, we've heard about sort of these increased requirements over the national standard. Is there a quality issue that we're worried about if we don't have those? Are we worried?
So
that
during the
folks
mental
won't be?
health modernization, there was no questions about quality of our workforce. It was about quantity. In fact, you can ask KU and Washburn, our social workers at all levels, we get 80% on our test scores. So we are, and there's a lot of states that are at the 60% range. And so unlike the other professions, majority of social workers, they get their bachelor degree, get a license. Then they get their master's degree, get a license. So you have to have a license, and so that's a test, bachelor test, master test. And to become a clinical social worker, you have 2 years past that and another exam. How many of us pass 3 national standardized tests? All for, and I don't want to pick on Kyle, but in many of our mental health centers, you get $40,000, $45,000 for a clinical social worker. So we have high bar of public trust. So this board-approved supervisor, it doesn't say, it said they would define in regulations. So you would submit an application, pay a fee, then in regulations, they would say how much training you need. This bill does not say that. So you might have to have 2 days, 3 days of training, and then every 2 years you would have to have a supervisor training. Our national association offers these supervisor trainings. They're $300, $400, and we don't have any in the state of Kansas. And I brought this up to BSRB many times. Why don't they do a lunch and learn every year, several times? Because the issue that most social workers have is that they don't understand the policies and procedures. Our state requires 12-page training plan to have accountability for the clinical supervisor with the master level. Other states don't have this huge training contract So many social workers don't want to be a clinician and a supervisor because they're liable on this huge training plan. And so I brought up, why don't we have free trainings for these supervisors? Why don't we have lunch and learns? Let's offer free versus mandated another mandate. And there's many ways we could educate without having another mandate with the profession that many have passed 3 competency tests.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I believe David Fye has a comment to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to provide some additional information. This has to do a little bit with the interplay between the statutory changes and the regulatory changes. And so, and I appreciate Becky's comments because we did have a conversation about the items in the bill and we walked through the different topics. And I understand her concerns about some of the items in the bill. In terms of, she mentioned that the number of hours would be set in regulation, and that's true. In terms of the number of those hours, that is something the board did weigh in on in terms of how many hours they would like to pursue in terms of the regulations. And they talked about a range of 6 to 8 hours in terms of that. So it really wouldn't be an unclear range of 3 or 4 days or something like that. That's the range of hours they were talking about. But however, this has to do a little bit with the difference between statutes and regulations. So the bill in front of you deals with the statutes. The regulations are also a conversation by the board, and they're planning to go forward with those to implement things. But that's why you don't see a more clear range here in the bill.
All right, we're going to have 2 more questions. We'll have Representative Epley and then Representative Reese.
Second time, and thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is easy. David, this is for you, so just stay right there. And it's an easy question. I actually have 2 different counseling groups that have reached out to me with students in the loop right now. They're in training. They've actually attained, with hoping for this to come into statute, they've done a lot of their hours virtually already. In fact, most of their hours. Will this just be going forward, or will it reflect backward on those students currently in the loop?
So the items in the statute, when that person applies and indicates what hours they obtained, the things that are in place at the time that they apply would be applied. So, if they applied after this had been passed or the regulatory changes had been made, then those qualifications would apply to those individuals. So it really has to do with when the individual actually submits the qualifications to the board for the review.
But just to clarify, they could have been obtained in the year 2020, this last year, the contact hours.
Yeah, there is a window to do some of these hours, but what would hold would be when the person actually applies. So if they would apply before these took effect, then of course they wouldn't have take effect. But if they were passed and then the person applied, then these would apply to those people.
Understood. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Reese.
Another question, David. Was there any talk in the BSRB to matching the supervisor requirements to match Missouri's? They passed one, maybe 5 years ago, where the clinical supervisors have to go through 16 hours of training, and then every 2 years, when you renew your license, you have to go through 16, I think either another 8, another 16 hours of training. And that is so excessive. I left Missouri. I dropped my Missouri license at that point, but I hope there's no talk of that.
And Madam Chair, I've been with the agency since just a little bit over a couple months, but in my conversations and in the items that I have heard the board discuss, they did reference the fact that Missouri does have board-approved clinical supervisors, and the hours that would be required in Missouri are higher than what the board is seeking here. So they were aware of that in Missouri, but the hours in this bill, really what they had discussed was the 6 to 8 hours for the initial board-approved certification, and then the additional hours after that point would be about 3 hours per year, including that hour of ethics in the bill. So I don't remember any discussion in terms of going to the number of hours that Missouri currently uses for their board-approved supervisors. It was focusing on this lower number of hours that are included or were discussed in terms of the regulations.
All right. David, I think a couple of things as I sit here and look at this. One question that I do have for you, is there any reason that this could not go into effect in the register versus the statute books?
Madam Chair, I don't believe the board had discussions on that point. I don't want to speak for the board on that point, but no one in particular I heard discuss that it needed to be in that for a specific reason.
All right. And I think just kind of a heads up from my perspective, and I think that some other folks are kind of feeling the same way, David, is that I'm not sure that we necessarily need new Section 1. That's creating a whole lot of heartburn. And I think also if you go over to page 10, lines 10 and 11, there may be consideration in striking a lot of that language to get rid of those 200 hours. Because I think that does put us at a disadvantage with some of our states up next to us. And then if we were to strike new Section 1, then we would also strike on page 14, line 30, 31, I believe that's the fee for the new Section 1. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's correct. It would actually be lines 3 through 31, just the reference to that, because that section just references that statute in terms of the fees.
Right, but number 9 only impacts Section 1. The other are the existing fees, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Just a heads up. Are there any further questions, committee? All right, seeing none, thank you very much, David. I appreciate it. I think we've heard some strong testimony on this, and as you heard, committee, there was a lot, and I do mean a lot of discussion about this. There has been for several years on how we can expedite without losing a standard of quality the area of social work. And there was a lot of it on the Mental Health Modernization Committee, and we were pleased that the BSRB was already, looking at some of this stuff to help reduce some of these hours. And so they introduced the bill, and we just think that there's probably some tweaks that need to be made to this bill. And we'll welcome any other suggestions. So this will close the hearing on House Bill 2208. And unfortunately, committee, we are
That poor bill never gets worked.
out of time. No, we are out of time to work House Bill 2159. We will have to, and I apologize to all of the proponents. I hope nobody actually showed up here in person for this bill, did they? Oh, thank you very much. We will look at trying to reschedule House Bill 2159. We are adjourned until 1:30 Monday.